First, maybe we can just go down the line and introduce ourselves.
Sure. My name's DePasquale. I'm with ADP.
My name is Zachary Smith. I'm with a company called Packet. We are not an enterprise.
So you guys all know me. I'm Raj, and the company is RainTech. Oh, wait a minute. No, it's Grafana Labs. So, yeah.
Scott Johnson with Staples.
Well, cool. So maybe I'll start with you, Raj. This open source thing. You're trying to create a business, right? How could you possibly think that just open sourcing this thing is going to actually help you make money?
It's a really good question. Depending on what side of the bed I wake up in the morning, I don't.
Yeah. Right.
It's really tough, actually. And if you want to play the villain, Alex, that's I think that'll be good because I actually think that most enterprises, given the way that they acquire and deploy open source and manage open source, it is a disaster, and it is a problem waiting to happen. I think some enterprises are doing it right. They have more accountability, they have support, and obviously I'm biased here because I want to help enterprises de-risk their deployments. But I think there's the right way to deploy open source in a safe way where you get the advantages, and there's the wrong way. And there's a difference between QA and test and prod, and that still has to be respected. So it's not a simple answer, I don't think.
Well, perhaps we can switch to a more enterprisey character.
Sure.
Carl, so ADP isn't in the business of open source software as far as I'm aware. And so all of a sudden you're here on this panel and you're a big company. Well, first of all, do you do it right, do you think? Open source?
No, I don't think we do it right.
Okay.
We do it kind of in the middle. We do, in a lot of cases, contract out for support for some of the open software products. Actually, we contract out to Grafana Labs now for support. Just a good plug. But no, I don't think we do it right because we don't have the right teams in place to support the open software. There's just a very small team that builds and uses the open software, and the rest of the organization tends to feed off that. We don't have really central repositories where people can go and actually pull in dashboards and actually learn from each other. We're still, by and large, an older brick and mortar legacy company, and we spend a lot of money with third-party software.
But I mean, that's what an enterprise should do, man. Like,
yeah, an enterprise should do it, but we can't, and I hate the term, but we can't be agile doing that. We can't, and I'll talk later on this afternoon, but we can't really adapt to the changing environment with third-party software. We tend to wait months, quarters, years for enhancements to products. With some of our open software, if I decide I need something, I need a new feature or I need a new analytical algorithm incorporated into Graphite, for example, we do it. So from that standpoint, we do it right, but we really don't have a whole organization that's going to support our open sourceware effort.
Well, so maybe come back to the non-enterprise world. After hearing these 2 points of view, where do you stand in all of this? Are you pro it still?
Well, when I saw the panel, and I had a couple of thoughts, right? I mean, first off, we as a company do not actively contribute to the open source community vis-a-vis our own technology. We're a consumer. We contribute it mainly from an ecosystem standpoint, which I think actually pinpoints to a lot of the issue or the opportunity for enterprises, which is really more of a cultural buy-in issue, right? And so we definitely disseminate that throughout our small company, but we've debated quite heavily open sourcing the vast majority of our product, and we've decided against it at this point. I can't say maybe you wake up on the side of that about how you're going to make money with open source. I wake up on saying, is there an opportunity from an adoption standpoint vis-a-vis open source? But at least from what I see as a service provider, the companies that are using our platform, who are large enterprises, who are leveraging open source tools, and mainly do it for a cultural reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we'll come back to that. I'm interested on the Staples side of things. I think you're somewhere in between all of these voices too.
A little bit in the middle, and I have to, it's almost like we planned it. The cultural piece, I think, is a huge drama that we have going on. I'm very fortunate you saw Yasmin, and we have a team here talking that are doing some great pioneering efforts and are blazing the right trail forward. But as SDN's taking off, as you've got OpenStack going on, you've got a lot more software-driven environments in legacy infrastructure and operations, you're hitting big pockets of resistance. So the cultural change, I think Yasmin did a little disservice. I think we probably have every one of the tools that were up there, plus another 40, that you've got people holding on to tools that, like, their life depends on it. And starting to free that from them, open up and build the muscle internally, I think is critically important. And one thing that I do want to compliment the team on is you've got to invest. What you put into open source is what you get out of it. They have formed a Go meetup in the area that we're in Boston, outside of Boston. So it's good to get the community and show our involvement in it, but also some of it's self-evangelizing inside our own company, helping to get people to do that. So I think the cultural piece is a huge aspect for us.
Well, so you've all mentioned the cultural piece here. Why is that important anyway? I mean, to you, Raj, like, you've got to make money. Who cares about culture?
I mean, culture is still really important to us internally. You know, the fact that we're an open source company, yeah, I mean, monetization is still important, but being open source actually helps us attract some of the best developers around the world. You know, being open source also helps us have a relationship with our customers and engage with them on a level that we just couldn't as a proprietary vendor. In fact, like, culturally, I mean, kind of little bit on the line of what culture is, I guess, but I just think that the relationship between a lot of open source vendors and even companies and enterprises is not at all like the traditional relationships between software vendors and enterprises. It's not as nearly as contentious, because at the end of the day, if ADP or Staples says, you know what, you're charging me too much, you're treating me badly, you're pulling an Oracle-like move, they have the option to just pull the ejection seat. And they know that, and we know that. And that just creates, I think, a much better sort of relationship based on trust and capabilities rather than, you know, steakhouse dinners.
Yeah, I think that, along with the velocity of the market and reacting to our consumers or our customers' retails under, you know, tremendous pressure from Amazons, from a lot of e-commerce vendors that we're fighting with, as well as just the margins are razor thin. So being able to offer new services to our customers, and as we do that, being able to adopt that quickly, partner with companies like Grafana to get stuff that's adding business value very quickly. The velocity is not what it used to be, and that's a big driver for us as well.
So on that, I wanted to ask about the speed and velocity. There's often a mismatch between what a small startup can do and what how fast an enterprise can move on things. And I know that in my own dealings, I forgot to introduce myself, by the way. I'm Alex Scammon. I work at Rackspace. We do Blue Flood, who Staples mentioned earlier, do a lot of open source stuff. So I'm not always the villain, but I'm playing one today. So I know that there's a mismatch often with our dealings with Grafana, for example. There's something that has taken me a year to get done, it's still not done, to work with Grafana more closely. So, Carl, do you have the same experience where you actually want and are working with open source software and it's just moving too fast for you to even catch on?
Generally, well, what we have.
Is your mic on?
It should be, yeah. So the answer really is no, right? We can keep up with the open software, and the way we're segregated is we have legacy organizations, what I'm in the infrastructure and operations side, and we have basically several little companies within ADP that have taken full advantage of open software, Amazon, Azure, all the new containerized methodologies. So it's not so much that we don't, we do, and we've done that by spinning off separate, more or less independent applications. It's more the traditional legacy that we're working with when you have mainframes, and we still deal with mainframes. That's the problem that we have. All right, they're not as fast. They have methods, procedures that have been written over 50 years, and we're going to follow all these procedures. And it bled over into, you know, the Linux world, you know, the Unix world, Solaris, etc. So no, we don't have a real problem keeping up because we've established independent organizations, and we're probably bleeding edge in many areas. The ones that the legacy apps, that's where we're having the issues with, and they're slowly coming around.
I want to come back to the two middlemen here, because you have a difference of opinions on whether you should open source your your software, and it seemed like you were suggesting there's a fundamental difference in the business case that or the business value that you're driving at, so you've decided not to. But I don't know, Raj, do you think this is the wrong move for this man here?
No, I don't think it's the wrong move for Zach. And by the way, Zach and I used to run a hosting company together before we started the companies that we're running now. So it's a topic that we've actually talked about for kind of decades in the past. But I think it's different for a pure play hosting provider. You know, if you're, I mean, like, I wouldn't suggest that, Packet as a purely offering hosted services open source the whole stack. I mean, it might be a good idea, but it's not obvious. If you're dealing in on-prem DevOps software or infrastructure software, I really believe that all that stuff is destined to be open source.
Well, then, do you not run the risk of not having the culture being able to attract the talent who you need?
That hasn't been the issue so far, I guess. Just to explain like more why we have decided not to open source a core amount of our technology, we think that the community that is interested in running and deploying highly automated bare metal compute platforms is relatively small. And because of that, we think that it could actually be a drag for our community, right? That, you know, we've seen a lot. I mean, let's just say that the gorilla in the room is definitely OpenStack, right? Huge investment in a already large and well-functioning and, you know, highly adopted community. And to propose something which I think is extremely opinionated and narrow into the open source world, and then the investment necessary for our company to make sure that that doesn't die in a forest and we actually get any value from that would be, we think, immense for a small business. So I think that's why we've decided not to. We do, I would say, on the other side, and what has actually attracted talent to our business is our support of other people's open source software. So what we do, instead of hiring, you know, a small group of community managers to keep our fledgling, you know, infrastructure open source software in the community, we do it the other way, and we actually pay to open source companies pretty actively. So the vast majority of our toolkit is run off of, say, Rancher. We're an enterprise licensed user of them. We sponsor a lot within those communities, and we sponsor build projects for open source. So that's our way to access that community instead of our own software product.
You mentioned talent acquisition again, and I'm just curious about ADP and Staples. You mentioned the cultural component of it all. Is there a negative component to attracting people who like open source software? I'm just playing my role here.
I think it's really it's the converse, if you will. It's hard to attract talent that want to work on mainframe systems and the older boxes. The newer open source applications, the Grafanas, the Graphites, whichever time series database you prefer, or whatever flavor of the day or week. The people are really interested in getting involved in that technology. I think in the years to come, there's going to be a shortage of the older folks with gray hair or no hair that actually know how these other systems work.
Well, let me just sort of probe there that it's really easy to jump in on a new open source project.
You bet.
That it's fledgling, I can write all this simple code, but for an enterprise, you need to actually make sure that it runs at scale for many businesses.
Correct.
Your needs are very often very different from, hey, I just got this little server working, I can get HTTPS working now. and so you need, it seems to me, products that are on a different level, and eventually at least. And then the question on talent is also the same, where if you're attracting a lot of people who really like the beginnings of things, the genesis of things, and you hire those people, do you see a problem with those people coming on board and then getting bored when they actually have to deal with the mainframe?
No, I don't see them getting bored, because what they would have to deal with the mainframe is really REST interfaces and just adapters, to pull from the mainframe. What typically happens, or what we see, or what I believe, is that we bring in the young talent They like to play, they build the applications in the open source community, and what we try to do is actually groom them so they understand the performance of the application, the capacity planning that needs to go involved, the instrumentation of the application so that it basically provides self-healing information that we can feed back into our monitoring systems. So we try to grow the individuals after they're doing a little bit of the coding to understand some more of the high-level information that needs to be provided. And the application instrumentation is critical. Sorry.
Oh, I would just want to make a comment there. I mean, one of the things that we found with hiring, let's say just open source aficionados or as developers, is that many often tend to think all open source software equals freely available to use. Mm-hmm. And as a small company, say, building your own technology set, I mean, we recently went through a Series A fundraising with a public company, fairly intensive software audit and licensing code. I mean, we're only young. We're only 18 months in, and we had to take serious components out because of a developer using something that they shouldn't, against our policies, but just kind of genericizing open source is all kind of available from the candy box. Mm-hmm.
So let me comment any open software that we bring in immediately goes through legal. So we don't let anything come into our environment until it goes through legal. We know we have a license if we need it, and we know we can use it freely.
So you're blocking wget on GitHub?
We're blocking everything. And if you need to get out to it, yes, you can, but our developer just can't go up and wget whatever they want. So we're again. ADP, payroll, money, bank kind of mentality here, folks. So, yeah, we do block.
On that front, where does Stable stand in terms of licensing and using other open source software, but also contributing just?
I mean, look, as you go through the process, it's like a wedding cake. It's different layers. You've got to have the governance infrastructure, work with your legal departments, get those. The scaffolding built there to what is the process that you're going to onboard the technologies, how are you going to do the code reviews of things you're contributing back to the community. But if it's something you're committed to, I think it's like any strategy, you've got to push forward on it, and you're going to hit roadblocks, and there are answers to it. And the team has done a great job of pushing through that. I think, similar to ADP, I have similar issues, and I see it a little bit differently in that, you run into, it's more of a leadership and architecture problem for me. I think as a leader, you've got to drive and not let it fracture the group into two disparate different teams, and there does grow to be animosity. There are mainframes, and as long as you keep those in the environment, you need to have that talent. It's a respected talent, but if you treat it like the redheaded stepchild or lipstick on a pig, then that breeds into your organization, and that creates a chasm between the two teams. And as a leader, you've got to work really hard to bridge that gap. Both are needed. Mm-hmm. And at the architectural level, and you talk about, and people make that argument a lot, if you're consuming open source, is it industrial grade? Part of it is attracting the right talent to be able to do it, and part of it's architecting it so it doesn't blow the entire environment up when you put it in. So put pressure on from those aspects.
Mm-hmm. This is a question sort of open to anybody, but when you're evaluating an open source product, what do you look at? Because it might be gone in a year. You might use it and find in 6 months that it wasn't the thing.
I'll take a shot at that, but I'm biased, and it's one word. It's community. That's the number one thing. And it actually ties in with a point that I think Zach made, which is when considering to open source a project, part of the decision-making process hasn't just got to be whether it makes sense to open source or not, but whether you have a good chance of actually developing and growing a community around your project. Because otherwise, why does anyone care? And even worse, if an enterprise like a Staples or an ADP finds this abandoned project on GitHub that was open source a year ago that no one's working on, guess what? Even if it looks like a cool thing, they're probably going to pass it by because community. And that's what I'm really kind of back to what Torkel started with Grafana and the awesome community we have. I mean, that's a huge asset, I think, and important, I believe, to enterprises.
I mean, the people can be wrong sometimes.
Sure.
I mean,
companies can be wrong, I think.
True, true.
And related to community, I guess this would be a question back to not only the room but the panelists, which is around we've seen kind of foundations make a much different role in terms of open source because you actually have projects that are outliving their original creators too, right? Mm-hmm. So people who have passed away and are the core maintainers of their own project, right? And I think Linux Foundation is doing some interesting work there in terms of just broadening the kind of oversight kind of role of projects. because the scaffolding for a project that might even have 2,000 stars on GitHub and 50 active committers, could be a problem, over a long enough period of time, especially at the kind of the velocity that projects seem to move at.
I'm curious, actually, at this point, just to know in the audience who's who. Who works at a company that's like more than 10 people? Who works at a company that's more than 50? 100? 500? 1,000?
1 million.
Yeah, 5,000, 10,000. It's all right. So it's a good swath of people who work at some very large companies. Okay, so are there any questions for our panelists? So the question is, contributing to an open source project like Grafana, do we just give it away or keep it and sell it as a differentiator?
I think it's a tough part. I mean, it's definitely a little bit of a gray area. Each company is going to be unique. For us, we have a very rigid architectural review board and has various members on that from the business as well as the technical communities to review that and assess that as a company. So if we do it hand in hand with the business and we're looking at that decision, we can decide, is this really IP, to your point, that we may end up selling as a product or doing that? But I do think, back to the questions earlier, if you're going to go open source, you've got to be active in the community, and the team's done a great job already contributing back, and I think you've got to be an advocate to that community, to your point, Rod, to make it real, to make other people go to it. So that's kind of how we look at it and how we've gone through it.
Mm-hmm. The question was on forking and the anti-pattern of forking something internally and never giving it back, and it goes and lives its own life in your big enterprise company. I've seen a lot of this. I worked at Yahoo. Everything began with a Y. Everything was forked. It was great.
It is a problem, and I think you pointed it out correctly. It's a legal issue. Anything we develop has to go through legal, just like any software we download has to go through legal. We do have spin-offs that don't follow that same model, and they have actually contributed to the open source community. But by and large, ADP as a company does not. But again, our spin-offs do. So we have 4 floors over in Chelsea, and that organization is very much in tune to the open software, contributing as well as using it.
I think I can actually add, still in character, one of the other reasons that companies do this is because it's a hassle to work with the community, man. I just want to do this thing, and our needs are totally different than the community's. To hell with them. We're just going to go and do our own thing. And I think that comes back to what you were talking about in terms of leadership and just not letting that happen from a leadership standpoint. It's harder, actually, much more often than not, to work as a large company with those communities. And a lot of companies decide, to hell with it, we're just going to do our own thing. I hope so.
I think a lot of companies actually don't realize how much they're preventing themselves from continuing to consume the open source project that they're benefiting from. So a pattern we've seen is an enterprise may say, hey, we've done this awesome feature or whatever, and we say, we'd love to potentially merge it into Grafana, and they say, sorry, we can't. Mm-hmm. And then two releases go by. Right? And then what? Then they say we want to upgrade, and then we say, oh, but you can, right? And that suddenly clicks in their head, and they realize it's a give and take. And if they want to continue consuming, then forking is the F word, right? I mean, so basically, what we've seen is actually the majority of our enterprise customers who have initially been hesitant or unable to contribute back were eventually convinced, just due to the situation of wanting to continue to get the benefits of new releases, kind of come around. I mean, of course, there are some that just, it's an insurmountable legal challenge or whatever, but I have pretty good hope in general for people seeing the logic in it.
Has there also been and I don't know in this project but in others, we saw it in the early days of the OpenStack project where people forked it pretty regularly for stability reasons because the project was moving too fast for them to actually use it. So they would stop, fork it, and then actually was quite an effort to move back to mainline. Maybe that's also a challenge, right, with just the pace.
We've got time for 1 or 2 more. It's a good question. So is it risky to depend on an open source project?
Well, entirely, yeah. I mean, if you wouldn't want to run your enterprise on entire open source that may be buggy, may not be buggy, may be better than than the proprietary software. So, I think you have to take it in projects, in small projects, and look at an open software piece of code, and if it fits that small project, start small, and then if it's stable and it performs the way you want, then you can move into other areas in the enterprise. But not something that you'd say, okay, I'm going to throw out Oracle and I'm going to use something else.
One last question, and I think we'll be done.
My question is around indemnification. As a service provider, when I put open source into a customer, their legal says if they're sued, I have to go to court and pay their lawyer fees and defend the whole thing. And some open source companies, then the commercial support gets you indemnification. Is that something that you're looking at?
Absolutely. That's one of it's probably a top 5 reason why enterprises buy support, at least from Grafana's indemnification.
Okay, so does that,
Yeah, the red tank balance sheet.
It's more symbolic, right? It isn't our paltry balance sheet. It's definitely just a symbolism that we're confident enough in the legal situation that we're willing to throw the entire company out, to defend it. Yeah.
So one last show of hands. Who works at companies who put up roadblocks to you contributing to open source software? And everyone with me say, boo, boo, bad. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for the talk.